Good afternoon and welcome to our Tips and Tricks webinar. My name is Alex and today I'll be presenting on regular expressions in ES and Twist. So first, a few housekeeping notes if you're new to our webinars. There's a zoom button if my screen is too large or too small on your screen. There's a zoom button in the title bar you can use to adjust the scaling. There's also a Q&A area there where you can use to type any questions you might have. Typically, we wait till the end of the webinar to go over questions, but if anything particularly relevant to anything I'm showing on screen pops up, we may pause to answer that particular question then. As mentioned, this is part of our Tips and Tricks webinar series. We got out of the habit of doing these for a few years, but we're trying to get back into the swing of it. So I think now they're bi-monthly, so we're doing them the third Wednesday, usually of every other month. Typically, as soon as we know what we're going to do for the next month, we'll post details online at blendersystems.com/events and also on our Zendesk as well. So keep an eye out there for everything we've got in store for you. So as far as today's agenda is mentioned, we're going to be discussing regular expressions. And this is really intended as sort of an introductory webinar to get you introduced to the idea and familiarized with the idea of regular expressions and how they work in ES and Twist. So we're going to start off talking with a conceptual overview of regular expressions, what they are, how you write them, and then migrate into real-world examples of them in ES and Twist. Then we'll also try to talk during that period about some of the newer regular expressions that exist in ES6 and Twist 9 that you might not be aware of. Some of them have been in there for a while, but just they kind of flew under the radar. And lastly, we'll talk about pitfalls, limitations, common snags that people tend to run into with these things and how you can dig yourself a hole. So a few notes on scope on this too, because this is a very sprawling topic, and I think this is going to end up being a very long webinar. I think it's definitely going to be over an hour. I think it might be like an hour and 20 minutes, an hour and 30 minutes. So I'm going to try and keep this as focused as I can. The first half of this probably is going to be just a deep dive into regular expressions, what they are, how they work. I'm going to try and show during that period, even if I do pop into, for example, ES more than Twist at the beginning, just because it's got a bit of a newer, more modern regular expression editor, I'm going to try to make as many of those examples as possible relevant to both ES and Twist. But that's going to be a very deep dive. The second part of this is going to be showing you some real world examples of how these things work in ES and Twist. And that area is going to be more 1,000-foot overview, about 1,000 feet overview, and about 2 feet deep. Because regular expressions generally are dealing with pulling information out of text like file names. And then once you've got that information out, then you're just using tools like rule sets or MergeXP, like you would normally use those tools anyway. And it would be prohibitive. We'd have a 5-hour webinar if I did all of those. So I'm going to try and focus on the regular expression portion of those and not dive too deep into how those tools or how those functions work. For a lot of those things, if you're interested in them, if you see anything in here that piques your interest, you see how the regular expressions could be useful with that tool. I actually didn't have them for today, but I think when we post this on YouTube, I'll try and get a list of other webinars on those specific topics if you want to deep dive into those then as well. Now, as far as sources to note on this, I did spend a bit of time checking a lot of this information against the official Java documentation for ES, because ES uses Java's implementation of regular expressions, and for Twist against the official Tickle specification for regular expressions. We'll also be using, there's a site Regex 101 here, which they have some documentation. They have a lot of good example regular expressions. And they also have an online testing tool we'll be using for the presentation that makes it helpful to visualize how these things work and debug them. So I guess to get started here, what are regular expressions? They're patterns that describe certain kinds of text. So if you've got something like an address or a email address or a file name, there are certain patterns that tell you that they are what they are. So for example, the house numbers, the word street or road or boulevard or something, the comma followed by a 2-digit state ID and a 5-digit zip code at the end. Those are all just patterns that signify that this is, things that signify that this is the address or might be an address. Same with, for example, an email address where you've got the username, you've got the @ symbol, and then you've got a domain that ends in .com, .org, .net, something like that. And this come down to here, that these can tell that things match a pattern. They don't know necessarily that it's an email address, but you can tell that a piece of text matches that pattern. And there's 2 reasons why that can be useful. The first is so that you can extract information from this larger block of text. So for example, if you're dealing with particularly in print, a lot of what we'd be dealing with here for Twist and ES is file names. You can tell based on this file name, there's certain things based on our naming convention that are in here that we might want to extract. For example, the page number, the customer code, the project ID. With regular expressions, we can pull that information out and then save them into, for example, variables or metadata so we can use them elsewhere in our process. The second thing this can be useful for is if you have a case where you need to verify certain information is correct. So a good example is, actually, let me pull that back up. So eBay, for example, let's say I want to go create a new eBay account. If I go in here and I just start typing gibberish in the email field, it tells me that my email address is invalid, and it yells at me, it won't let me submit the form until I enter a valid email address. And how it would be doing that under the hood is it would be using a regular expression to see if what I've typed in here matches an email address. And as soon as it does, then it stops yelling at me for that. And actually, it's going to see me as a spammer because I've been doing this half the morning during my rehearsals. But it knows that it's an email address. So then it doesn't have to yell at me anymore. And you've probably seen that when you signed up for sites too. So in ES and Twist, that can also be useful for cases where maybe someone's entering a job ID and you need to make sure that that job ID matches the format and they're just not mashing keys to get past a approval screen or whatever. So as far as uses in Dalim products, there's a few that are common to both Twist and ES. So a lot of this regular expressions generally deal with any sort of text. That can be any text, but mostly in ES, and I think probably 95% of my examples today are file names. So ES and Twist are useful for extracting information from file names or variables. They're also useful for validating naming conventions. So if someone dumps a file into a workflow, maybe you need to extract information from that file name, like a job code or something, before you can run it. And if you don't have that job code in the name, then you don't have enough information for the workflow to do what it needs. Likewise, you could also have a case where a file doesn't match naming convention, and the assumption is that it's in the completely wrong workflow. Maybe you've got two product lines, and based off a naming convention, you know the file is the wrong naming convention. Someone probably pushed it in that folder by accident, and you don't want to run it through. So that can be a way you can make sure that the right files are going in the right place and you have all the information you need. You can use it to rename files. And lastly, there to check, set, and alter variables if you're trying to pull information out, like, for example, a job ID. So in Twist, as far as specifics that are unique to each application, in Twist, it can be used to control the scope of a lot of actions. And these are examples I'll be showing later today. So with Twist, you can use it, for example, to enable or disable channels in a file that match certain regular expressions, like if you're trying to extract like the German layer or a certain Pantone from a file. You can use it for layers for if you need to extract like maybe the German layer of a file, language layer of a file in a multilingual publication. Or for even for multiple files, if one of the examples I have for later is one to generate a 4-up imposition that combines multiple files into one imposition based on naming convention. Now on the ES side of things, it's also useful for predominantly in ES for assigning new pages to a job. So if a hot folder file comes into a hot folder, ES needs to know how to map that file to a particular customer, a particular project. And often that's out of either the folder path the file was uploaded to, or the job ticket, or something in the file name itself. It's also useful for validating job ticket metadata, like I said. So if someone, when they create a job, has to enter a job ID or a SKU or something, you can make sure that they're entering a SKU in the format you expect and not just mashing keys. So we've talked a lot about what these are useful for and generally what they are, but start diving into when we talk about patterns that we use for matching. What exactly is a pattern? So this isn't exactly a regular expression here, but it's a mock-up of what I mean is we might have an example file name where we've got 3 numbers at the front, an underscore, a bunch of text, an underscore, a letter followed by 4 numbers, and just an extension in here. So a lot of these patterns are defined by saying what type of data is at different positions in a piece of text or a file name in our case. And the first type is there's a distinction between what are literals and what are called character classes. So literals would be if there's something very specific to the file name that has to be there in a certain position. So for example, we're using underscores to separate the different sections of our file name. So those underscores tell us where the difference is between the page number, the page name, the job ID. So we're literally expecting an actual underscore at that position. Likewise is the same, we're literally expecting a period right before the file extension. There's some other cases where we have more generic classes where we know we need something like a number at front, but we don't have a specific number in mind. And that's where character classes come into play, where we can basically define a pattern that says I'm expecting 3 digits at the front of this file name, or a letter followed by 4 numbers at a later point. And these abstract classes can be defined in a few different categories. You've got numbers, You've got letters, which can be uppercase, lowercase, or really just kind of agnostic to that, to case. You can have alphanumerics, which handle both letters and numbers. For example, an extension is a good example of that, because most file extensions are like PDF, they're just letters, but there's some out there like MP3 that can have a number in there as well. And you don't really care about the case of extension. You don't care if it's letters or numbers, as long as it's maybe 3 or 4 characters. But so we've got a kind of a pattern here. As an example, we're expecting 3 digits for whatever's there's the last one here is wildcards, which match any character. So wildcards, any letters, any numbers, anything. It could be more underscores, at symbols, whatever we want. You can kind of go hog wild with it. It's just anything at all whatsoever. But so we've got a pattern here for our files with 3 letters, a wildcard, and our job ID with a letter followed by 4 numbers, that sort of thing. Then we can take that kind of abstract pattern and compare other files against our pattern and say, okay, this file name matches the pattern we have, even though it's different from our original file name example here, it matches the same pattern. Or no, this file doesn't match because it's missing an underscore here and it's missing a letter and it's 2 numbers instead of 3 at this point. So that's just an example of the sort of comparison you can do with these. So I guess to break down, and part of these patterns too, these aren't set in stone. Part of where things fall into, for example, literals versus character classes depends on your naming convention. So with this example I have here, I have for my job ID is a digit followed by 4, a letter followed by 4 numbers. And in this case, I'm assuming this letter can be anything. So it can be J23, A23, B23. It can be any letter in here. But you could have other cases too, where maybe you use the J to signify specifically that something is a job ID. And so the J is part of it, and it has to be J23. It can't be A23 or B23. In that case, you would treat, rather than treating J as a letter, you would treat it as a literal in there, where it's exactly what it is. Likewise, right in my example here, I have the title here, could be any characters in here. So it could be letters, numbers, just random punctuation. Maybe we have that title has to be alphanumeric or has to be specifically just letters. You can use your, you can define your pattern in such a way that it enforces that for you. So these things aren't necessarily set in stone based on type. It's you have to look at your naming convention and determine what makes the best fit for your data. So after looking at just kind of this abstract patterns, here's an example of a regular expression here. And we'll get into if this is scary right now. We'll break it apart in a little bit. So don't worry about this just yet. But you can see we've got the same kind of general pattern where we're specifying 3 digits at the front, a literal underscore. We've got our wildcards, our job ID with the letter and 4 numbers, and we're basically specifying everything out there. So there's one more thing we need to do to this before, because right now this early one we have here, this will tell us whether or not a file matches a regular expression. But it won't tell us whether or not, it won't let us help us pull information out of here, because that's half of the thing these are useful for, is when I'm finding out a file matches the expression. The second thing's useful is I want to pull a job number out of this, or I want to pull a page number out of this. And you can do that with what we call atoms in, so I think Twist calls them atoms. A few other products out there call them capture groups, which I like as a name. So as you see, we added these parentheses around different areas of our regular expression. And what these atoms do is allow us to pull information out and assign it to different variables or metadata or whatnot later on. So in this case, we can pull out these 3 letters at the front as a page number, or numbers, I mean. Apparently I failed my alphabet there, but or pulled out the job ID of this letter followed by 4 numbers as the job ID, and then save that into metadata and use that elsewhere for file renaming or for checking if files meet a certain criteria. These atoms, these capture groups, they're not mandatory. You don't have to do them. So you, for example, let's say we don't really care about the extension. We don't want to clutter up all the information we're collecting. I can just remove the capture group and the rule will work fine. I just won't get that extension as something that I can retrieve and use in my workflow there. So I guess now we'll get into, the meat and bones of this. I'm trying to think of a good way to do this, because this is it's going to be a lot of just a data dump. So hopefully I don't lose you guys if I do just holler. But as far as different parts of regular expressions and these character classes that build them up, I have a regular expression tester here online we're going to use. I have a bunch of different text we can test against in here and see what happens. The first thing I'll mention is there's these two characters that I have in here, this caret and this $sign. I'd say just ignore these for now. Generally, you don't need to put those in an ES, but the way this little test application online works, I'm putting those in just to signify at the start and end of my line. So it's testing the full line as a whole rather than specific characters within a line, just so that this thing behaves more like ES's matches. But if we're starting with just simple things, the first is those literals I mentioned. So for example, a literal, I can just type in any character as far as my regular expressions. If I type in just A, it matches just the uppercase A. If I type two A's, it matches just the two uppercase A's and not the one. You're building a pattern here, and it has to match each thing in here is, each element in this regular expression represents one character, at least at what we're doing right now at the beginning. So 1, 2, or 3, or whatever. If I do B or lowercase, whatever, it's going to change to go along with that. Now, there's also character, and that can even be used for example, if I want to do, for example, matching words like add or edit, I can type in a full expression where I'm literal there for a specific word or something if I need to match that word exactly. But as far as other things in there, the character classes too, is maybe you don't know exactly what letter you want. So I can type the uppercase A to Z, and that will match a single uppercase letter. I can do lowercase a to lowercase z to get a lowercase any lowercase letters in here that are single, so that'll match any of those. And there's actually, even if I want to do a uppercase or lowercase case insensitive letter, I can do the capital A to lowercase z within these brackets. And this might be going a little too into the weeds, but if you're trying to understand what these ranges come in with, it's based off some of the old ASCII code tables in here, where I think you can specify basically ranges of characters. You can see you want to match certain ranges of characters. So you can even do kind of breakdowns in there if you want to do just like A to C or something and match that way. But uppercase A to lowercase z gives you everything lowercase or uppercase letters. Now for numbers, it's the same kind of deal with 0 to 9 within your brackets. Do I have any? I guess my test doesn't have any numbers in here. I think maybe I grabbed the wrong, sorry, let me, actually I grabbed the right one. I just didn't have any, I missed that scenario when I built my test here. But for example, that's just one letter or one number. And if I do A to Z, 0 to 9, that will capture any one letter or number. And I can repeat each of these classes. Everything within these brackets represents one character. And if I don't want to paste Wikipedia in there, that won't help me. And so if I put 2 in here, I can build 2 of anything, or I can build more specific patterns. Like I can say I want a uppercase letter followed by a number, and it will match that. Or like 2 of those, or an uppercase letter, a lowercase letter, and a number, and that would match A, B, 4, or something like that. So I can drill down that way. You can also do things in there where maybe you have certain characters for one of these matches, where for one of your characters you want either A or C. You can type any of the characters in there, and it's going to match any of those if they exist for that particular character. So it'll match either A or C, or maybe I put in there 3, and it'll match whatever characters I put in there. You can also do, this is just to make things confusing, there's a caret for in here. It's different than, again, ignore this one up front, that's a separate thing. But if you have a caret inside one of these brackets, it says match anything, any single character here except the 3 characters in here. So that'll match anything except uppercase A, uppercase C, or 3. But it'll match any other character, whether it's a wildcard or whatever. We also, actually, that's a good point too, we do have wildcards in here. So I can just put a wildcard that'll match any single character. 2 wildcards will match any 2 characters, 3, and so on and so forth. So everything we're putting in here represents one character at this point. We're building it up kind of bit by bit. We can make that more flexible a little later on in the demonstration. But as far as other things we can do here, I think the last thing on this slide was just doing like an or. So a good case would be maybe you have add or edit. that would match either of these two literals here. So that either's a match of maybe I have add or editorial pages that need to match this rule that I'm building. That will do that for me. You could also do that with more complex things with these ORs. So I could say I want 2 letters or 0 to 9, 1 number. So that would match 2 uppercase letters or 1 number. So you can build some pretty complex expressions with these things. So I think maybe the next thing then is we've got kind of the idea of just these general patterns where we're building up with each of these in a row to build our rule set. We've got our digits, our underscore, wildcards, and you can see you're basically slotting in one of these classes for each item we want to match here. But let's say your favorite customer comes to you and they have a new naming convention where they've got 52 uppercase letters followed by an underscore followed by 9 numbers. Do you have to type this whole thing out in ES? No, you don't. You can just, would it be nice if there was a simpler way you could just say, I want 52 uppercase letters followed by an underscore followed by 9 numbers. There's a few quantifiers you can use to control how much a match is applied or how frequently a match is applied. So a good example would be if we go into our example here again, and we'll start with our basic one we had before, which is just to match an uppercase letter. Now, if we take that uppercase letter and we change that to a plus, then that's going to match any uppercase letters in here, any number of uppercase letters. The next one would be star, which is going to match 0 or more uppercase letters. Actually, a better example for that one might be, sorry, give me one sec here. I probably should copy, and I got a example of our file name from earlier that might be good to use here for some of this. So let's get rid of those. So just to go in here with our first, with the 3 digits at front, if we put a plus, that will match any of these files here where there are 1 or more digits at the front of the file name. Star will actually match 0 or more of these file names, digits at the front of the file name. It doesn't need to be, that element doesn't need to be there for it to match, but if it is, it doesn't interfere with the match. So you can see this one here that doesn't have a page number still wound up matching here. You can also specify certain numbers of matches. You could say maybe I want specifically 3 digits if you put it in these brackets. I want 3 digits at the front of my file name, or I want a range, so I want between 1 and 3 digits at the front of my file name, so you can control how frequently that matches. Now the next thing in here too is this question mark or this quantifier for example, for lazy matches. This is an interesting one because this is I think a pitfall people run into sometimes. These particularly the like if you're talking about the asterisk or the plus, those tend to be greedy. They'll try and match as much as they possibly can, and that can cause issues for you with some processes. So I think as a good example, let me pull up. I got a few more names here I'll paste in that we can play with. So we got here these. For these, we got these file names where we've got a first atom, which represents our production code. We've got a second atom here, which represents the file name. So maybe we have a case where we want to extract this information so we can use it elsewhere with pulling out, for example, the production. We know this was produced in Philly. We know it's called sale. But the problem in this case is our wildcards are greedy, so they'll try and grab as much as they can. So you can see this one here, our production location got set to New York back to school, and the page title only got set to sale. And the reason that happened is because it's greedy, it'll try and grab as far as it can without stepping on this second wildcard group here. And the second wildcard is supposed to grab everything after a underscore. So this is going to grab if there's only one underscore, the first one's going to stop at the first underscore because it's the only underscore here and hand off to the second one. If you have multiple underscores, so someone put underscores in their title, then the first one's going to keep going until there's one underscore left. It's going to be as greedy as it can and try and grab as much as it can. And then when it gets to the point where at the very end, when there's finally only one left, then it hands it off to the second atom and says, okay, it's your turn, you can go ahead and have this, I'll let you have this pittance at the end. So That's how that ends up working here. What if we want to change that? We don't want this to grab the half of file name for the production code. We can add the question mark in here, and that tells it only grab the bare minimum you need, and then leave everything else to this other rule. So this will grab everything up to the first underscore and then stop and hand it off to the second part of the rule. So that can be useful sometimes with wildcards. That tends to be a trip up for people, is them grabbing more things than they expect. Actually, one other trip up I'll mention too, I think, before I just look at my notes to make sure I didn't lose anything here. One other thing I'm kind of going to go a little out of sequence here is with that 0 to 9, or that A to Z. I saw it in my notes, I forgot to mention it, but let me put in these guys again real quick. So the one thing that I've noticed with these two is if you have something like a French or German text and it has a like an accent or an umlaut on it, those don't match with these standard character classes. So sometimes you have to go ahead and you can actually add them in because they're in the brackets. That'll match anything in the brackets or anything in the A to Z range and this accented E here. So I don't know how much that comes up in North America. I suppose it could with Spanish or French text being run here, but that's one thing. I looked online. There's a lot of different arguments online I see about how to handle those, but that's one solution I saw. So just a heads up that could be another corner to dig yourself into. But now there's one last kind of category here of things to deal with. Let me get back my, did I lose my good expression? Yes, I did. Let me pull that back in. So that's what I get for changing the sequence I intended to do things here. So let me make this one lazy again. So we're good here. So we've got the caret in the front. This is the caret outside of the brackets, means basically starting with, and the dollar sign means ending with. Usually you don't need to touch those in ES, but these are constraints that add some extra stipulation or specify something additional about the match that's separate from the specific characters you're defining or the quantity of how often they appear. And this is constraining it to be, this match needs to start at the start of the line and end at the end of the line. I believe ES and Twist in most cases tend to imply this, so you usually don't need to put these in your rules here. One other one that tends to work, I think it works in ES only, but you'll notice here, theoretically, because I have this wildcard right now, theoretically I could try and like harden this against that lazy issue I had here, or the greedy issue I had here, by saying I want my customer code or my plant codes to be just uppercase A to Z. But that you'll see that catches all the uppercase ones, but it doesn't catch, for example, Philly. I theoretically could go ahead and do like I guess an A to Z or whatever, and that sort of helps with that too. But it doesn't catch this one down here where there's spaces in the name. So the one thing I could do with actually, I don't know if I don't think I planned this example as well as I should have. I don't know if this was the one I intended it for, but we'll do it here anyway if it doesn't make the most sense. But for some of these, you can, if you have like a longer thing, actually, maybe it's you're looking for specifically for the Philly plant name somewhere. Let's do that one. So you're specifically hard coding literally for Philly for something because it needs to be match Philly in part of your name, but you want it to match lowercase or uppercase. You could do like a PHL or PHL and do it that way. Or in ES, you could do a, I think it's at the start of it, you do a question mark I, and that will match either of them. It makes it case insensitive for that literal here so that either of those will match. I tested, there are some limitations of this. I think this is a newer feature, so this tends to work. I think in most parts of ES, it doesn't work in Twist. But I think that's kind of the, actually I'll look and see if we have any questions before I start on the real world examples to make sure I haven't lost anyone. Looks pretty quiet. I don't see any right now, so we can come back to them at the end once we get into the real world examples. But so as far as, we'll start I think maybe with ES and then move on to Twist. I'm going to try and keep a lot of these first ES examples deal with files, so I think they'll be relevant to you Twist people too. But as far as where you use regular expressions in ES, there's a few main areas. So the first is input channels, so assigning files to a project, setting metadata, A second is in program links, where you can also do some tweaking and manipulating of metadata. And job ticket layouts, again, for if you need to force to make sure that a job ID you're collecting or a SKU matches the expected format and someone's not mashing keys. And lastly, there's an option in file systems where you can have it ignore certain items, choose which files the file system sees based on whether files match a certain naming convention. Now, as far as ES, from what I've seen so far, because these regular expressions are implemented in programming languages, and different programming languages implement them differently. They have different flavors or features. So you can see on the site I'm testing on, they have different versions for PHP and Python, and so on, because Java, Python, PHP all have slightly different variations on how they implement regular expressions. In ES, everything you do through the interface, so input rules, job ticket constraints, file system stuff, that's all interpreted with Java because ES runs in Java. So that follows the Java specification. There's actually a nice documentation I actually have a link to earlier in the slides. We can link it on YouTube too, but that has all of the documentation on exactly what kind of character matches you can do. There's actually some cool special shorthand ones in here, which are different. Twist does some too, but they're very different for both of them. So even if it saves you a little time, you lose portability of being able to take an expression from Twist to ES quickly. But that's something you can check out if you're interested in them. For program links, the program links in ES run in JavaScript, and they're interpreted with a different interpreter. I found out actually because I was running a few tests last night, and I found out some of the stuff I built in my ES rule didn't work correctly when I did it in a program link. I couldn't find any documentation for ES's specific JavaScript interpreter, which is Oracle Nashorn. But the Mozilla stuff, I think that has a few features that ES's doesn't, but it's still a good primer in general. You can also test, Java comes with a command you can use to test regular expressions and basically just test JavaScript code on the command line using the same exact interpreter ES does. It's missing a few features, like ES-specific features, like some of the context.set functions, but it does allow you to test any of the JavaScript code, and if it runs correctly in here, then you know that's how it's going to run in ES when you paste in your code into a link somewhere. So I'll show actually an example. We can step through this example later in the webinar. So, as I go too far. So I think with that, we'll jump into ES and start looking at this. So in ES, most of the expressions we're dealing with is we're trying to assign files to a project in some way. And the standard place where that's done is in the input rule, the input channels where files are uploaded, whether it's to the UI or an input channel or like a hot folder. They get looped and linked to these rule sets, which have different rules that look for file names that match a regular expression. And ES goes through these each one by one until it finds a regular expression that matches your file. Then it tries to assign them to a project based on the information it pulls out. So this is an example of the basic upload rule for files uploaded through the ES interface. You can see here we've got the 4 wildcards. We've got atoms around them or capture groups. And as you run the test in here, you can actually see what it's going to do with certain things. So you can see what atoms it will pull out. And then in both ES and Twist, if you want to reference one of those atoms, you can use a pound sign and then the number of whatever atom that is. So the first one's 1, second's 2, third is 3, and the fourth is 4. So then you can take those and reference those in and use those to map the file to a specific project or whatever. The default one, when you upload files to the ES UI, uses a few internal folders based on the year the file was up, project was created, the project template, and the project ID within that year as kind of like a compound ID. So those are just internal things that ES uses to map the file. And then the fourth is actually the file name itself, and it's mapping those out. I can adjust, actually, I made a test one here where I actually upload a few pages of my project, and hopefully my VM's happy with me now. I think I put in too many files for a small test VM earlier, and this thing caught fire earlier, so hopefully it doesn't do that right now. But I've got a project with a flat plan. Let's maybe upload 10 or whatever pages in here. And okay, they're going good. So no flames yet, fingers crossed. And while those are uploading, we'll go back and look at what our rule does here. So I made a special rule in here that does a few extra things. So the first 3 are still ES's internal code. The next, we have our file name has a page number or a folio at the front. It has a version code, and then it has digits afterwards. So what we're doing is we have 3 atoms set up to grab each of those 3 things, and we're using those to map the folio as that 4th atom, the version is the 5th atom, and the page number, we're kind of recombining them. One of the interesting things in here is, actually just as a side note, is on a lot of older systems, I think older versions of ES, the habit people would get into is having to basically rebuild the file name and put it back together based off these atoms that they extracted, basically rewrite the file name by calling 4, 5, and 6 in here. In newer versions of ES and Twist, what you can actually do is nested atoms. So I can take the file name and enclose that in another set of parentheses, and you'll see I get an extra variable in here for the whole file name, so I could call just 4 for that. And then I think these would be incremented to like 5 and 6. I'd have to change the numbers there too, but it makes it easier because then you can just call that nested atom and not have to manually rebuild the file name, which I've seen people having to do that for some very complex naming conventions, and it looks very painful. So let's go ahead and look at our project, and my test VM hasn't burst into flames, so I'm happy there. And if you look at some of these, you'll see that our page is matched up, and if I go into any of the versions, you'll see that my page is based on the version name and the folio name that it pulled out of the file. It assigned these things to their correct version. So all the Canada pages wound up in Canada, all the subscription pages wound up in subscription, and anything that didn't have specific version pages for that version pulls from the default newsstand. But we use the information from the rule to do that. Now, the one thing that's important when you're dealing with these rules in here is, let me actually set that to not assigned real quick. Let's go back to our setup here. Order of operations is very important with these rules. So for example, if I, let's say I'm creating this rule and by mistake, maybe I put it in a different place and I put the generic upload rule in front of it. If I go in here and I go to upload, let me put in a few more pages here. What you're gonna notice this time is these pages aren't, despite the rule I have, these pages aren't gonna map to their version and folio because these rules are evaluated in sequence. So ES starts at the top, it looks at the first rule, does it match? No, then it moves on to the next. It'll keep going until it finds a rule that matches. And once it finds one, it stops. So in this case, if you have the generic rule up top, then that can cause issues with that. In this case, that rule is taking precedence over my specific rule. So in ES, generally you want the more specific rules to come at the top of a rule set, and you want the more vague rules to come later on in the rule set as kind of catch-alls in there, so that way everything plays nice. This in Twist is sort of the opposite, where we'll get into later, but with Twist generally you want the most specific, the general rules at the top and the specific at the bottom. But that's because it's a different, the SetParamFromRE tool in Twist is intended for a different purpose. One thing that too, this can also become a mess with too, is if you have a lot of customers and you have one rule set for everything, and you start winding up with cases where you add a new customer and their naming convention is similar to someone else's, so it starts stealing their files. So one other thing you can do is split them off and have separate rule sets. So for example, maybe I've got an FTP upload channel, input channel. I can make a custom hot folder rules rule set for that and link those and put my rules in a separate place so that they're not fighting each other. And just as another quick example too of these, I have my, let me find my, where's my trusty fake FTP here. So my FTP is set up here. I gotta get one more window up here. Bear with me 1 second. So what we're gonna do here is we have a few rules in here to pull in things from a file system. So these are all done based off of all my customers in ES have customer codes by them. So they have little just quick ways you can name, you can reference them. And my rule set up, so my FTP root is here. We're pretending it's an FTP for now. And within that, we have a folder structure where we have, actually we'll make a new folder. We'll call that maybe during webinar. And we can go ahead and upload just any old file in there. Sorry, give me 1 sec here. And that should, with any luck, pop into our hot folder and go through this rule. And what that's going to do is get assigned into our project. In this case, our project doesn't exist. It's actually going to create it. That was this one. So you can see it created our project automatically and it pulled in our page. And it knew how to, because when you're dumping into a hot folder, you need to tell it how to map a specific page to a project. And that could be done in this case based off of folders on the FTP like this one, or that could be done by maybe there's customer codes within the file name itself. But that can be useful here. The one snag, the snag I was going to mention, but it just slipped my mind. I think maybe what I'll show is you could have specific cases where maybe you want, oh yeah, that's what I was going to mention. Theoretically, you could make this actually the customer name on the FTP too, rather than the code, but that tends to get unwieldy. And if someone has special characters in their customer name, that has a tendency to get messy fast. So I tend to like these codes as a quicker way of doing things here. Now, again, since these rules are done from most like specific cases to generic, you can have also other special cases in here. So I've got a case here where we've got a customer, the non-standard workflow heretics, and they have their own special case where they want to run their files to a different workflow than everyone else because they have some special need. So what I did in this case is it's basically the same regular expression format, but instead of letting the first one be a wildcard, I'm forcing that to be that customer code for my heretics here. And what it's going to do is then if it matches the rule, this is a literal in here, so it's going to match only for that specific customer code. If it matches the code, it's going to follow this rule. It's going to do this standard assignment, and it's going to run through a completely separate workflow. So let's go ahead and we can push a file in here. So that's going to go ahead and go in, and that should pop up in our customer shortly. Yep, so there we go. So it came in and got processed in. And theoretically, you don't need to, like, because one thing in here that might come up is you see how I have my, I have a literal here, so this is always going to be NSWH. So why did I put that in an atom rather than actually type in the hard code, the customer code is NSWH here? And the main reason I did that is for consistency with these other rules, with the generic rule here, because this way I don't need to, if I did that, if I got rid of the atom here, then all these numbers would change. And then my customer code would be hard-coded, my project name would be Atom1, and my document name would be Atom2. That adds an extra layer of complexity when I have multiple rules here that I'm trying to keep consistent with each other. It also makes it easier because if I have a case where I need to change, for example, the heretics change their customer code or something, then I can update that in one place and it'll still use the atom and pull out the correct new code. So I don't have to update it in the regular expression and in the match criteria here. So that's a case that can come up there as well. One third case is actually a good example of greediness in these regular expressions is subdirectories on an FTP. So let's say I got into a case where someone wants, they're uploading folders into an additional subdirectory under, do I have, I think I had one, I got rid of it. So maybe they're putting files into a subfolder under here, or maybe even 2 or 3 subfolders in here. Then this is what the expression that this is actually Dalim's default kind of I copied from their default rule set. What is why do they have this? Because they could have theoretically, couldn't they have just done a .star for 4 atoms and then just map this to be the folder? The problem with that is laziness in here. So we could try that is .star. So from the first place, that rule's only going to match if I have one subdirectory in here. If I don't have a subdirectory, it's not going to match. So again, it's separate rules for folders and not folders. But if I go ahead and I do a one subdirectory, it works fine. But what happens is these are greedy. So if I add in a subdirectory 2, then all my rule interpretation goes completely off and my customer code is listed as the customer code plus the project name, and everything moves up because these rules are greedy and they'll try to grab as much. The first one will usually try to grab as much as it can, and everything will kind of move up a bit. So you could do it the way Dalim did it, where they're basically looking for any character that's not a slash that represents a folder. and then they're putting a folder literal in and separating it out that way. Theoretically, I don't know if there might be a reason why they didn't do it this way, but theoretically you can also make all these but the third one lazy and put in the question mark, and that will keep them from hogging the stuff and make sure that the atoms get parsed in the correct way here. So that's how that works there. You can see even with theirs, the first two are that kind of look for anything except a slash. The third one's the greedy one, even in their kind of Dalim standard setup here. So that's how that ends up working there. I'm gonna check my notes real quick because I don't remember what I'm supposed to be doing next. So I got too many examples, it's a problem, but I guess a good problem to have. So, okay, good. I got past the part of my notes where it says PRE-ES doesn't crash, so that's a plus. The next one is, I guess maybe we can talk about metadata parsing. I know we're coming up an hour. It's probably gonna be maybe another 30, 40 minutes here. I'm trying to truck through as quick as I can on these examples. Hopefully this is all helpful to you. So the next example is, we talked about getting files into projects. What if I have metadata? I guess, yeah, going back to our slide, what if I want to do things with metadata in here, get information out of the file names? Well, I built an example. Let's see if hopefully I can find it. So I have, coincidentally, it's all things that were near my computer at like 1 a.m. I decided I was going into the office supply business, so I made a little example bunch of items, and I've got a naming convention for all these things I'm going to put in my store, either on my website for sale or my print catalog. Now, there's a lot of good information in here because I've got my brand name, I've got my product name, I've got my SKU, I've got whether this is like a front or a top shot of the item, and I've got the intent about whether it's intended for print or web at the end. So that's good information that would be useful to have in ES for just metadata or search. So what I'm gonna do is go ahead and go to my definitely not copyrighted Office Preponderance company and upload a whole bunch of these files to it. And actually, I think this is what my notes were saying, PRE-ES doesn't crash on me. I'm running this on a tiny test computer, so this thing isn't really built for production loads here. But
you really should
you'll see
these systems.
Well, I got a lot of moving parts here, so that was a lot to move up into the test server. So I should probably just set up my own AWS instance, or like get a actually dedicate this PC to running just ES and use my laptop for everything else. But you can see I got files coming in, and the way this works is, I'll let those crunch. We'll go over to our office supply rules here. Again, keeping separate rules for some of these separate companies because I don't want them all in one place, where if customer A suddenly decides they have a new rule set that looks like customer B's, I don't have this one giant conglomerated rule set where everything's fighting everything else, or customers' files are getting mismatched to each other's places. But again, we have a little bit more of a complex rule here. So actually, I don't know if it'll actually fit on the screen, the whole thing. I can actually bring that, maybe I'll bring a text window up here so that you can actually see the whole thing. So if I give me 1 sec here to window up, and we can, so this is the full rule. So we're looking at the file name and picking out as the first atom, well, first three of these standard ES upload things. Then after that, we're picking up, there's a nested atom, so we're picking up the entire file name, so we don't have to rebuild that from scratch after we pull 2 billion things out of it. Then within that nested atom, we're pulling out first off, we're pulling out the beginning of the file name. We have the brand name is the very first thing in here. Then we have the 2 dashes, literal. Then we have the product name. Then we have the SKU in here, which is 2 letters followed by numbers. I actually forgot to remove this. I was originally going to show some of the shorthand syntax in here. That really should be 0 to 9, but same difference. It's a SKU of any number of letters followed by any number of numbers, but it has to have both in the SKU. Followed by, I am hard coding on case insensitive top, side, front, and bottom for a lot of these, the shot angle. And then I've got 1 digit at the end before the extension just for the intent. And I'm actually doing something interesting down here. It's kind of, they hid it really in the back of ES under system config. hidden way in the production area here, there's an option where you can take any metadata property in your system, say, I want to make that available within rule sets for assignment, so that you can assign that on upload. So if I go back to my office supply companies here, you'll see that I have all those options available to me. If I click to add a new whatever, I can click them in a drop down and say I want to map something that I pulled one of these atoms. I want to map that to this metadata for the page. So you can see in here I did that for all the things we talked about, so the brand, product name, and thereforth, and so on. And so if I go into my project here and I pull up my handy job ticket, you can see I got the brand name, product name, SKU, all came in as metadata for this. And that can be very useful because I've got it in here, and it's not maybe in the exact format I want it because I've got hyphens in here from the naming convention, but it's at least something that I can then go in ahead and just like, I can at least go in and massage it a bit, but it's in there so I don't have to do all the manual typing or looking up myself, hunting and pecking at the file name. It's also useful for if I go to do, like, for example, a search, I can see in here and search based on things. So if I want to search for maybe, I want to see all images I have associated with Mr. Right brand or the Tech Supplies brand, or even drill down into based on these two brands, what do I have that's a front angle of a deluxe roller pen, and really drill down in my search to get to the exact item I need. That information's already in the file name, so pulling it out of the file name and assigning it this way makes it easier to search for later on without someone having to manually go into a job ticket and add all that by hand. But now the one snag, like I said with this, is the formatting is not ideal, is the first downside to the way we're doing this right now. So in here you can see that it's not exactly formatted the way we want it. Maybe can we get this a little prettier? The second downside to doing it this way is maybe you've got different rules like we did earlier where we had the one customer that had a different workflow. We had two rules for them. Well, if you had two rules like we did for that one, you would have to set that metadata in both of those rules, or like whatever 20 rules you have, and that's a lot of manual work to make sure you get that set up the same in both ways, especially if these naming conventions change down the road. So the one other way you could do this is you could do this in the workflow in JavaScript, not have the rule handle this parsing the regular expression, but have your ES workflow do it. So what I'm going to do here is go ahead and we're actually going to delete all these files so they don't mess with my search in a later example. And yep. And we're going to go into this new Office Realm customer down here, and we're going to upload the same batch of files here. And you're going to see when these files come in here in a second, they're going to have much prettier names. Once they're finished, they have to go through the workflow this time because the input rule is not doing the parsing here. The actual workflow is in this case. So maybe a second. This might be where my ES catches fire. But while it's doing that, we can actually look into how this workflow is. Actually, we got one here. So you can see this one went in and it parsed the name actually pretty nicely. So you see the other pen company, it actually got rid of the little dashes in there. With the product name, the fountain pen, I got rid of the dashes and actually title cased everything in there so that it looks a little more like a proper product name. And I'm doing this programmatically, so it's not perfect, because, for example, USB, if I do it title case, it gets the casing for USB wrong, but it's still better than nothing. It gets me a little close to my end goal. And if I do a search in here, for example, it looks a lot cleaner because I've got my product names a little cleaner than they were. Maybe some cases my rule didn't account for, like the fountain pen here, but all these other ones look a little nicer. It's easier to filter on. You don't have some end users looking at a little more kind of cryptic gibberish here. You'll also notice I got the print and web. I think I actually made a few mistakes there, but even though the file name has the W or the P, I got the actual full name in here. So we can parse through a little bit of this. So how did I do this? I have a workflow in here, and that workflow has a special link at the very beginning. So what this workflow is doing is we can actually bring up a JavaScript interpreter. We'll actually bring up a clean JJS session and we can step through it. So first off, I have a test example here. This is using the exact same JavaScript interpreter ES does, but allows me to step through and debug it. So we're setting an example file name. We can see we've got our file name with all the stuff in it. Then what we're doing next is we're setting a regular expression. Since this is JavaScript rather than Java, I did have to change a few things from the ES one because it didn't like that case insensitive thing I had in there for the shot angle. But we have a regular expression in here. And the next thing we do is compare our file name against the regular expression. And that will tell us whether or not the file matches the regular expression. If it does, it'll give us a whole list of everything, the file name and all the things it pulled out of it. So we can go in and see, for example, the first is the brand name, second's the product name, and so on. This allows you to even do checks. For example, if you want to see if a file name doesn't match, you could then set a piece of metadata and route it to like an emergency spot in the workflow or set defaults or something. So that gives you a little control over what happens here. The second thing I'm doing then is I'm checking, I make sure I found it and it's the right length, it parsed it correctly. I don't want to proceed if it got a weird count off the match and it might be mismatched. All my contents might be mismatched. Don't want to mismap things here. But what I'm doing then is generally taking most of the variables and just taking them and setting them straight into ES metadata without tweaking them at all. The next thing I'm doing though is for the two variables, the brand and the product name, I'm doing some massaging. So the brand name is simple because basically what I'm doing here is I'm just taking it, I'm running a simple replace all to replace all the dashes with spaces in here so that that's a little simpler to read. The product name, I didn't want to mess with space or anything because some brands do have idiosyncratic spacing or capitalization. I didn't want to tweak the capitalization here, so I left it all is, I just replaced the dash. But for the product name, I actually found a cool little snippet on Stack Exchange. JavaScript sadly doesn't seem to have a real good default built-in way to do title case. So what this guy on Stack Exchange pitched as an example I found was very useful, link is there. But what this does is this actually uses a regular expression, which is a little over my head to be honest. But what it does is it looks through the file and looks at it grabs the first letter of every word and makes it uppercase. I think it loops the word, and anything that matches the first letter of a word, it changes to uppercase. Anything that matches a subsequent letter of a word, it changes to lowercase. So that one, I think that might be a little out of scope for today. I haven't had a chance to really dig into how that one works, but it's kind of nifty. And then the other three, like I said, it just goes through and just writes into the metadata untouched. So if you're doing it this way, definitely to be careful because if you're doing this in a program length, though, it's more convenient because you don't have to put it in a bunch of different rules. But if you're actually dealing with code in a program length, there's a lot more ways. If you make a typo, your workflow would fail out or something possibly. So just something to be aware of there. There's trade-offs and benefits and drawbacks to each of these approaches. But two other interesting things you can do with these before we move on. The first is actually because we have this metadata in here for things like intent, you can even use this to drive which direction workflows go. So for example, we're marking these as either web or print intent in here. So we can send them to different branches in the workflow based on that. So if we actually look at these files in here, based on the intent, I set it so that I think it was the web files don't have to go through print files go through a design approval, but web files don't. Because we have a rule in here that says, yeah, if it's a web file, skip the design approval. It's not going on a print page. We don't need the InDesign person to look over it. So that's a way of using metadata we pulled out of a file name to determine where files go in the workflow. And if we look at these, you'll see that based on that metadata, these files are going to different places in the workflow, whether that's the marketing approval or the design approval here. The second thing this can be useful for too, actually this is kind of segueing into the next topic, is job tickets and validation. With a SKU in here, for some of these fields, you can set it up so that they need to be a certain format. So if you look at the actual setup in customization, we go into webinar and SKU, thankfully it's right towards the top. You'll see there's a regular expression field in here if you have your metadata type set to string. And what that allows you to do is set a regular expression that anything you enter in the SKU field here has to match, which in this case is one or more uppercase letters followed by one or more numbers. And if it doesn't match that, then it won't let you save it. So actually it's kind of broken in the side panel here. I got to yell at Dalim, but if I go into, for example, standard traditional job ticket, I can change this and I try and make it like something like just gibberish in here. And just to get past the screen, it yells at me that I haven't filled this out correctly. And only if I do something where I have one or more letters followed by one or more numbers will it allow me to save that field. So that way you can enforce, in this case, is optional metadata maybe, but it's if anyone wants to type it in, they have to type it correctly. You can also use those same sort of validation checks at other points in ES. So for example, maybe you have a SKU or something like that, or an MIS job ID that needs to be entered when the project's created. If you make that mandatory and set a regular expression for that, then people can't create the jobs until they give you a valid regular expression. They give you a job ID and a valid job ID at that. So the one last thing in here too is for file systems. I'm going to go quick. I know I'm over. I want to get to some of the twist stuff so I don't leave you guys hanging there. But the last place in ES this can be useful for is file systems. So if you go into the file system setup in ES, and I go to my RAID, for example, there's an option here where you can do folder and file expressions or excludes to tell ES which folders or files you want it to ingest into the file system or recognize and run into workflow. So for example, let me find my file system here. It's see if I can remember where my, sorry, momentary brain fog here. I have it in my notes. Actually, might be this user can't see it. Sorry, give me 1 sec here. So let's try this one more time. Unless I did something horrible to my RAID here. Oh, maybe it's something's data. Okay, there we go. I'm just bad at. So if I go into my RAID, you can see I got a bunch of files in here, including some JPEGs. Now, my file exclude regular expression here is set to exclude anything that is starts with a JPEG in it. So what that'll do is anything that's not a JPEG, it will ingest and make available for viewing in ES. So you can see my file system has some JPEGs, it has some not JPEGs. If I go to my actual file system here and look at an ES, and this is actually a good cautionary case here, is because I made that lowercase only. This is a common trip up both here and twist and ODOT is not accounting for someone put in a JPEG that had an uppercase extension. My rule was expecting it lowercase. But aside from that, so that's something to be aware of when you build some of these rules. But aside from that one, everything else with a JPEG doesn't show up in here. I think some of the default ones they have in ES set up for this don't show anything that starts with a period, which is like a hidden file. Because like the common case is if you have like Mac users, they have like the DS store files. If they're connecting to a network share, those will show up if you view that share on a PC or a Linux machine. You'll sometimes see those DS store files left by Mac users. That filter can be used to hide those and make sure they don't show up in ES and get ingested and run through workflow and clutter the system up. So that's about the gist of the ES stuff. I think we'll move on to twist here. I don't think I've seen any questions about ES, so we'll move on. Let's see what notes are real quick. Okay, so twist, I'll try and keep the simple stuff. The simple stuff is pretty much the same as ES, so I won't spend too much time on that here. We can get to some of the fun examples. So in general, with the simple regular expressions, it's very much the same in twist. Typically, you're doing these in SetParamFromRE, where you're basically looking at like a file name or a variable or something and trying to parse it according to a regular expression. So let's say, for example, I have, let me get some files up here. I have some version files here somewhere. And we can parse these for things like the page number and version like we were in ES with our flat plan example earlier. So you'll see these rules, example. Can you guys still hear me, or I wasn't sure if my microphone was cutting out there?
No, you're good. If y'all can hear me in just a second, Alex has to get reconnected. So we'll wait for Alex to get his technical issues squared away.
There we go.
There you go. Now I can hear you.
It was funny. I clicked on twist and I lost my sound. If it happens again, I'll call in. But okay, here we go. So sorry about that. So we have here regular expressions. I can hear it starting to cut out again. Hopefully it's good. If it happens again, I'll just phone in. But so we have our regular expressions here, and yeah, it's funny. I think it's happening when I click on twist. That'd be an interesting bug. So tell you what, maybe I'll see if I can phone in real quick. And that's funny. I tried to bring up my workflow and look at something, and it's going.
Definitely an interesting bug. Can't wait to report it.
Some Java thing. No. Maybe it's just the regular expression window. Maybe I have to be careful and not talk.
He's on right now.
Yeah. What was the regular expression window earlier? I was clicking on a rule and it did it. But so maybe that's what we need to do. We just don't click on a rule. But yeah, because it's basically set up in here. I have numbers, page number, version, and issue name or whatever. So I'm basically parsing out the information in there from same thing we were looking at in the flat plan example, and I'm saving that into metadata. So each of these examples is looking at one of those three atoms. I kept them all the same because the regular expression is the same, but that way I am getting that information and saving it into variables. So if I go ahead and look at my twist table here, I can see my folio set to 1, version set to newsstand, issues set to whatever that issue is. So that way I can then use that in other links or in other calculations or whatnot elsewhere down the pike. So the order of operations, actually, we'll skip the order of operations stuff for now, but that's just a simple regular expression set up here. You don't have to use file names necessarily too, like this is set to file name right now. You can also use variables. So for example, maybe you have a common one I've seen people do is getMem reflith. I think it was, I can never remember the spelling of that one. I think it's preflith or something. And you could do, like a good check would be maybe you want a specific case where you want to check if the preflight results that are in metadata say that low res was detected. The preflight report will tell you that, but I forget what the exact text is, but if it matches like low res or whatever, then variables low res is set to true, for example. It's not losing the sound again. Nope, still good. It was cutting out for a second. But if it happens, if I get lost again, I'll just phone in. But you can see here that it's basically pulling out that information, setting a flag so that I know it was low res. I might want to take it to a different branch in the workflow and do something different like it with it, like alert it above and beyond the preflight check. So you can do that with variables too, or information you pull out with file check. That works there as well. Now these rules also do have some, because I was talking about tickle version earlier, so I think I'll show you an example of that. So I have a tickle version example here, which is this one right here. And I made a slightly fancier version of my regular expression with all our quantity matches in here. And what those are telling us is so it's matching page numbers between 1 and 3 digits. Version code is always 2 digits. And if I run things through that workflow right now, they should pick that up just fine. So we'll put a new file through this new workflow. And wait for that to come in. And you'll see it picks up the folios 2, version is newsstand, and issues, whatever that issue is. I probably could have made that a bit tighter. That's actually a common issue too, is forgetting to account for extensions in some of these places. It's always something to watch out for, which clearly I missed here, but good teachable moment. But right now this is working. And actually one more thing I'll mention before we get into the tickle thing is I added a new rule in here too for, with ES, we were talking about an ES with file names, where the file rules were looking for the first rule that a file name matched, and then using that to assign the file. In ES, you generally wanted the most specific names at the top and the most generic at the bottom. In Twist, we're not really trying to assign a page, we're just going through a list of rules no matter what. So generally you want the most generic rules at the top and the most specific later on. So in this case, I have an initial rule that no matter what the file name is, set version to unknown. So this way, if a file comes through and it matches a version, that version will get set and it'll overwrite the unknown there. But if a file comes through and it can't parse out the version, that version variable is set to unknown. So that way, at least I know that the version's unknown and I can route it to a different part of the workflow and do something special with it. So that's something that can be handy in there, setting those defaults. That can be like a philosophy thing. There's a lot of other Twist tools that will let you do regular expression parsing directly in them. But oftentimes, if I can avoid it, I try and prefer to do it in the SetParam so that I can set defaults. So that maybe if I'm trying to set a delivery path or something and I don't have I can't figure out the delivery path, I have at least a default and I can send it to somewhere that's like an emergency drop-off location. So that way, if it fails a little more gracefully there. Getting back to the main kind of drag here with this, there is, if you go into the right-click properties area in a Twist workflow, there's the ability to set Tickle support version here. Traditionally, Twist for the longest time supported only Tickle 7.3. I think they added 8.5 maybe about 9-10 years ago. But Tickle 3 was the long-time version, and older workflows tended to use that by default. There are some changes in Tickle 8.5, so that sometimes might break older Tickle codes. So Dalim tends to make any older workflows, if you have some things that you built in Twist 5 or 6 or whatever from back in the day, those tend to be associated as Tickle 7 workflows for compatibility reasons. And sometimes you have to run those older workflows in that version so that some older code will run. But if you have one of those older workflows set to that older version of the work item supports, then if we try and run that same example again, then this time it's going to fail in here. So let that click along. And if we go into our SetParam, you'll see that this time it didn't match any of the rules because Tickle 7 didn't know how to deal with those quantity matches. So that's a snag you can run into. Another big snag here is this test option that lets you test some regular expressions. That lets you test to see which file names might match your rules. But this doesn't, I don't think this uses the same regular expression interpreter as the actual workflow does. So for example, even if I have my workflow set to Tickle 8.5, this test doesn't run against Tickle 8.5, so it won't give me an accurate test result. It would show this result, this file, as not matching the rule, even though it does. So I've seen it even not just in this case, I've seen other cases where this just didn't match up with what actually happened when I ran the file. So the one in ES works very well, the one in the ES input rule editor, that's consistent, you can rely on that. But the one in Twist, I wouldn't always trust the output. It might be good for a quick test, but just beware there. I've had some issues with that in the past. So I think the next thing is we got through just the general examples here. I think very similar to the ES stuff. So I think we'll get into, I know we're running late on time. I'm going to try and go through really quick. I have about four or so really cool examples I'm going to show. And then we'll, just after that, open up the questions. I'm going to try and get through those as quick as I can. Thank you for hanging on. I know this is a long one. So first of the examples is, because these are a few cases outside of the SetParamFromRE where it can be useful. So the first is the FilterGroup tool. So let's say, for example, I have a bunch of single PDFs and I want to make a multi-page. So I have 4 pages or so here. And just standard PDFs, standard single page PDFs, each of them. And I want to make these into a multi-page book. I have a workflow here that's going to do that for me, and it's going to do that with the FilterGroup tool. So this tool, when files come in, the FilterGroup tool is going to look at a few different things to determine how to group pages together. And I'm telling it needs to match the file naming convention with our page number, version, and issue name. And the way this is set up is you control the grouping based on, you tell it which atom you want to control the grouping. In this case, it's the second atom that's controlling the grouping here. So it's our version code is going to control the grouping. Theoretically, I probably should have made that closer to the third one, where it's the version code and the issue in there, but that controls what does the grouping. The next thing is I need to know what's page 1, what's page 2, etc. in here. So the first ordering here, that first item with the page number tells it the ordering. In this case, I don't know how many files are coming in, so I'm just hard coding that to 99 and setting a 30-second timeout and saying grab as many as you can in that period. So that's going to run through. And actually, if we look at our output folder, that should come through soon. That might be waiting at 30 seconds. Oh, did I upload them to the wrong workflow? I uploaded them to the wrong workflow. No wonder that didn't work. Sorry, it was a user error there. So I'll push this in and maybe wait 30 seconds for those to crop up. Oh, we did get one. I did do it correctly. So let me grab that really quickly. We get a second window open here, and let's download that and take a look. So you'll see that that took all our pages and it got them in the correct order. So I got page 1 first, page 2 second, page 3 third, page 4 fourth. That tool can be very useful for other cases, even when you don't need to just combine files. There are a few other tools that are more efficient for combining large numbers of files. But another thing, because for example, maybe you want to zip these files up, you can have it rather than do the merge, just group them and then throw that to like a compress tool to make a zip file out of them. I've seen some cases where it's useful where maybe you have a bunch of things that match a customer code. You just want to take those random files and zip them up and send them somewhere. This tool can be useful for that as well. And that's using the regular expressions for that. The second example is, let's see here, I have a packaging example here. So I have this very beautiful cereal box, which is definitely convincing. And if you need me to, I'm available for commissions if you want me to refresh your branding. But this is our cereal box with a die cut and a die cut. We've got special spot colors in here for a few things. So we've got die lines in here. We've got also die comments explaining where things are, like the top flap and where the margin is. And no one pay attention to the fact I forgot to put a bottom flap on the bottom of this box and the cereal's all over the floor and I'm gonna lose my job. But we'll ignore that one for the moment. But I got all these things in here. And let's say maybe for whatever reason I'm running a proof or something, I wanna see what it looks like without the die lines. And maybe because we're really splashing, we're throwing out all the money there, this is gonna be a coded cereal box. I don't want these uncoded Pantones in there, so I wanna convert those to CMYK, but I wanna leave the coded Pantones untouched. I can do that with the, I have a special workflow here that uses the channel mapper here to do that. So I can remember what it was called. Suppress dies, here we go. So I'm gonna push the file in and while it's running, we can explain what it's doing. So what this is gonna do is I have a separation map tool in here with a bunch of different rules that are regular expression baked. And this is going to look at, do I have my file here still? Yep, so what this is gonna do is this is gonna look at the channel names in my file and decide whether to keep them, convert them, drop them based on some regular expressions. So the standard channel names in here are just gonna go through just by default. I'm not changing anything with them. I added a new regular expression for any channels that match started with that contain the name die in there. So my die line and my die comments, and I want to drop those completely from the file here. So I'm just ignoring them. I'm not mapping them to any color in here. I'm ignoring them. I also have a separate rule for anything that starts with, I got the caret here and the $ sign at the end. I want anything that starts with Pantone in caps and ends with a U at the end to signify uncoded. And if it ends that way and it matches that rule, then it's going to convert it to CMYK or process color. And then anything else, there's no rule for my coded, so they're just gonna fall into the general other catch-all and be ignored and just go carrying on. So let's close this guy. Let's close that page. Let's see if this should be done processing now. So output. Actually, no, I gotta go to my twist server. It would help if I look in the right place. Yep, so we have an example. Go ahead and download that. And you'll see here we got our file. It's got all the die lines removed. And if we do the look at here, you can see that we have no die lines in here, and we got rid of the uncoded spots are converted to CMYK. but the coded spots are still intact. So using regular expressions to really dial this in. I didn't want to make this too complicated, but of course, in some of these cases, you can make these more specific, where maybe you want die or die or die. I've seen a few people do it where I've seen a few systems where people had it like uppercase or lowercase d, so every character is kind of independent in there. Or yeah, it was actually a D or D kind of thing where it's either or for each of those sets, so that you actually spell it out that way so you match any sort of casing in here. So something to keep in mind there. I see Fred's taking bets on how long I've gone, so I'm going to try to wrap this up soon. I have 2 more examples to show you guys.
You get the over, don't worry about it.
I figured my test run was an hour and a half, so I'm about on schedule for what I expected. Thank you guys for hanging in there so long. I got 2 more quick examples and then we can wrap this up. The next one here is I've got a textbook here. And this is a multi-language textbook here, where we've got a few different layers in here. And we're using, helps if I click the right button. And this there's different languages on here. So I've got French, English, German, just different languages mayors. And maybe I want to split this out into different products so that the PDF for the German one goes to the German printer and so on. I can use the
second one from the top, layers.
Oh, layers, there we go. I'll learn my alphabet one of these days. Let's drop this file in, let it cook, and we can see what we get as output. So what this one is going to do is we have an extract layers tool in here, and this is going to look at the layers defined in that file. And right now, first off, it's going to disable all layers by default. Then for every file that comes in here, it's going to enable the base layer just as a start. And then for anything that matches the one of the language codes, it's going to enable those, but it's going to do that in separate files. And it's going to split out actually 3 different files for my 3 different languages here. So I get the kind of baked localized version of this cover for each market. And this field, I think, actually allows text. So if this was different each time, you could even do like a get mem variables, my languages or my countries or whatever, and get that variable. So like a hypothetical example would be if maybe you're doing a reprint, you have production drops in an XML file with a name of the PDF to grab, path to the PDF to grab, and the versions that need reprints. So it says, okay, I need the French and German reprints. You could then use that to set this so that it does just those 2 versions and delivers them to where they need to go. So that you're not kind of hard coding that every time. But let's go ahead to our FTP and take a quick look here at, and you'll see we got 3 PDFs out. And if we take a look at these over here, you'll see we got our French one, we got our English one, and we got our German one here. So those all got localized. If you open them up, all the layers are kind of simplified. So in this case, I specifically wanted it to drop the other layers. So that's about the gist of that there. Now, one final example here, because I know I'm going way over. This is actually, I stole this from a former tech of ours, Mike Muscato, but I think it was a very good example to show you how this can work in situations where you have multiple files coming into play. So I built a workflow that does a simple 4-up imposition. I've got these 4-up. I have these 4 PDFs here, just single pages, and I want to slap these into a 4-page 4-up imposition template. So I have a workflow to do that. So I'll go ahead and push these pages in there and let it cook. So what this one is going to do is files come in, our naming convention is looking at the 2 atoms. So the first is basically like, what's our book, what's our version, what's the thing we're doing? And our second atom is what's the page number within this template. So this template, MergeXP, is way outside of scope of this presentation, but if you're interested in it, Mike did a really good webinar on it years ago. That's still up there, and I reference it frequently because this tool terrifies and confuses me. Very powerful, but very opaque. What I'm doing here is the second one is to match either 1 or 2 or 3 or 4. And depending on which it matches, I know which page, each of these is kind of a pre-slotted page position in here. Let me see that. Okay, yeah, I accidentally deleted one when I was looking. But I have 4 pre-designed page positions in here, which tell me what arrangement they go in and what rotation the pages are. And I'm using this to slot that number at the end of the file name to say, okay, page 1 goes in this slot in the imposition, page 2 goes in this slot in the imposition. And then each of those is set to handle, for example, the rotation and everything that needs to be done for that impo to happen. So if I go over to that should be done, and then once it gets them all, it's going to merge them all and lay them out, and life will be good there. So let's go back. That should be done cooking now. So we got 4 up. Let's pull that down and take a look. And you'll see we got our template down here, and we got our pages laid out the way we wanted them. So that's a cool example. One of the reasons I wanted to show that one again was just because it's very useful for showing how these can come in handy in cases here where you're dealing with multiple files and merging and combining processes, because that's a very twist thing that doesn't tend to happen very often in ES. But with that in mind, I think the last thing is just a quick slide on pitfalls, like a summary of pitfalls, and then we can go into questions. So, and then Fred and Ryan and whoever can settle up their bets on how long I was going to take today. But I probably should have done separate twist and ES ones, but
You're good.
So missed a few slides there. So as far as common pitfalls, just to summarize, we discussed a lot of these during the presentation, but what sort of issues can you run into with these regular expressions? So the first is excess wildcarding, where you have cases where, first off, cases where you use star and rules and you wind up having files that you didn't expect to match, where you have maybe one customer's file matches another customer's file's rule, or wildcard grabs something you didn't expect it to grab because it was greedy. Also cases where I think a lot of people forget about the dot plus. I think that's a very useful one. I tend to use it a lot when I set up workflows and when I set up rules and different things. The dot star is, sometimes it's useful. There's certain cases where you want something, you really only want something optionally. But I think it tends to be overused a lot. You can run into cases where you wind up with like a gibberish or an empty field because that specific bit of the file name was missing, like a few of the examples I showed earlier. Order of operations can be a very big one. We've got a lot of customers who have rules where they have one big SetParam and twist, or one big rule set in ES with tons of rules from multiple customers. Those customers have very big wildcard rules, or naming conventions are constantly changing. That can be a case where you run into a lot of conflicts with files matching the wrong rules, or things like that, or file rules not matching updated naming conventions. And again, order of operation there too, where sometimes when you wind up doing a lot of that shuffle, sometimes you wind up with a very, in ES, for example, a very generic rule at the top that's eating files it shouldn't. So, or vice versa in twist, again, that order being different. And then of course, another one you saw me do a few times today is, for example, like extension mishandling is another big one. So cases with people forgetting extensions, or forgetting about case, or not handling them in regular expressions, that's another area that can really trip you up. Lastly, as I mentioned, twist tickle version can be a thing too. Sometimes older workflows will default to tickle 7.3 for compatibility reasons. Sometimes we've had weird cases where someone needed to set a workflow back to that just because something they needed to do wouldn't work in tickle 8.5. But that can be something that if you try and use one of these in twist and it doesn't work, that might be one thing to look at. But yep, that's pretty much all I have for today. So hopefully that was helpful. Hopefully everyone's not asleep right now. And any questions?
That was very thorough, Alex. A couple questions, and one of them I think you did answer was, can you use nested atoms? I think you showed that, if I'm not mistaken.
Yep, you can use nested atoms in both. I think it works in twist too if you're using tickle 8.5. I don't think it works on twist 7, or tickle 7, but yeah, I did show that you can use that if you go into, I had a rule here that was set up, it wasn't set up to use nested atoms by default, but if I go in, because this was separating things out and I was manually rebuilding the document name, but if I nest this in another set of atoms, then my result will show me the actual full document name, and I don't have to manually rebuild that by hand. I can just call atom 4.
Right. And then the other question is, will all of this still be used in ES Fusion? Pretty much what will be in Fusion would be more what you've seen on the ES side, because it's going to be in JavaScript. And Tickle will be no more finally. So switch with Horizon, which will be the comparable product to ES Fusion. There's no more Tickle. It'll all be JavaScript and more like what you're used to in ES now.
Yeah, and actually, this is a little bit of speculation on my part, so take this with a grain of salt. But my hunch is even if it is JavaScript in Fusion or Horizon, it might not necessarily be the same flavor they're using in ES, because ES currently uses the Oracle and the Shorn JavaScript interpreter to do its interpretation, and that interpreter was deprecated after Java 8 because ES runs on Java 8 currently. So I'm assuming Fusion probably won't run on Java 8.
Yeah,
I could be wrong on that.
For Duo United, I have to look back at some notes.
Yeah,
It was
so
covered. I think Tim specifically covered what version would be used.
yeah, because there might be other interpreters that handle things differently than ES's. But actually, that would only be a program link thing. The ones that are done in ES for these rules, these are using the Java one. The only example that was using the Shorn was the one I did in the workflow earlier, where I had the parsing things out in the workflow here. That was using the Shorn. So that one might change in Fusion if they use a different architecture there. But take whatever I say with a grain of salt there.
Yeah, we'll see soon enough, hopefully. So
yep.
Should have our hands on that pretty soon. Okay, thanks, Alex. That was great. Very thorough. Our next webinar will be in the month of August. I'll be on the road trip in July visiting some customers with Dalim. So we may be coming to see one of you next month. In August, what I'm planning on covering is more than likely going to be the Nasuni and CI Hub integrations. I should have those completely tested out by then and would like to cover those and have a decent webinar on it. So look forward for that. The invite will be going out sometime in the beginning of August. So thanks, everybody. Appreciate it. Alex, thanks. Great job.